The shatter came before the pain. I still hear it sometimes in my sleep, a sharp, explosive sound that rips through the quiet. I had been sleeping on the living room couch again. My sister had decided my bedroom was better suited for her weeks ago, claiming hers was too small to contain her vibrant energy. My parents, of course, had let her. In fact, they encouraged it. She's the one who will amount to something, my mother would say with a proud smile. She needs her proper rest. So that night, I was curled up on the lumpy cushions, trying to make my breathing as shallow as possible. I knew the sound of me just existing was an irritation to them. It was well past midnight, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, when I felt something cold and smooth press against my cheek. Before I could even process the sensation, it happened. Crash. The edge of a heavy drinking glass split across my face, slicing a deep line in the skin right beside my eye and down toward my nose. I gasped, a strangled sound born more of pure shock than pain. The stinging came a moment later, a wave of fire that spread across my skin, followed by the slow, warm trickle of blood making its way down my temple. Looming over me in the darkness was my father. He was gripping the jagged base of what was left of the glass, his chest heaving up and down with an anger so pure it was terrifying. "Maybe now you'll learn to sleep like a human being," he hissed through clenched teeth, his voice a low growl. He spoke as if I had committed some terrible crime against him instead of simply breathing in my sleep. My mom drifted in from the kitchen holding a dish towel. She didn't look scared or worried. If anything, she looked satisfied. She tilted her head, a small, cruel smile playing on her lips. "Finally," she said, her voice light and airy, "now you're pretty enough to match your worthless life." My stomach plummeted. I felt the cold dread wash over me. This wasn't just a punishment. For them, this was a form of entertainment. From the hallway, I heard my sister's laugh, a sound like tinkling bells made of ice. "Guess you'll finally stop breathing so loud now," she called out, walking past me without a second glance, as if I were just a broken piece of furniture on the floor. The wound on my face throbbed with a life of its own, but I didn't dare move a muscle. I knew better. My father crouched down until his face was inches from mine, his breath hot and smelling of stale coffee. "Don't even think about running to anyone," he whispered, his voice dangerously low. "We'll tell them you tripped over your own laziness. Who do you think they'll believe?" They didn't offer me a bandage. They didn't ask if I was okay or if I could even see properly out of my eye. Instead, my mom turned back to the kitchen and in a perfectly normal tone told my dad to clean up the broken glass before it stained the carpet. He tossed a single paper towel in my direction without even looking at me, muttering something under his breath about how useless people couldn't even bleed right. I stumbled to the bathroom, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper towel. I pressed it against my cheek, wincing as it made contact with the raw skin. The cut was deeper than I first thought. Every time I blinked, a fresh wave of burning pain shot through my face. I finally dared to look up and caught my reflection in the mirror. My cheek was already starting to swell. A trail of blood snaked over my jawline, and my eye was squeezed shut. I had to grip the edges of the sink to keep myself from collapsing. It wasn't just the physical pain that made me feel faint. It was the bone-deep certainty that if I were to pass out right there on the cold tile floor, not a single one of them would come to help me. That night, I didn't go back to the couch. I locked the bathroom door and slept sitting up in the corner, my knees pulled to my chest. For hours, I listened to the sounds of my family. I heard them laughing in the kitchen, the clinking of plates as they had a late-night snack, the muffled sound of a show playing on the television. My name was never mentioned. Not once did anyone knock on the door to see if I was even still alive. The next morning, my mom banged on the bathroom door. "Get out! You're hogging the mirror, and some of us actually have lives to live." I unlocked the door and shuffled past her, keeping my head down. She grabbed my chin, forcing me to look at her. She examined my face with a smirk. "Don't worry, honey. Scars can be character building. Not that you have any character to build on." My dad was at the kitchen table, his eyes glued to his phone as he drank his coffee. "Remember," he said, not even bothering to look up from his screen, "you keep your mouth shut. Breathing too loud already got you this far." My sister, her hair perfect and a smug smile on her face, added her own poison. "Maybe you should just stop breathing altogether. It would save everyone the trouble." I went to what used to be my room, but the door was locked. My sister's music was blasting from inside. When I looked out on the porch, I saw my old clothes, the few things I owned, stuffed into black garbage bags, like trash. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't a one-time thing. It was never going to stop. It was only going to get worse. I pressed my hand gently to my wounded cheek, feeling the steady, painful throb, and I made myself a silent promise. They thought they had broken me. They thought a scar would be a brand to keep me small and quiet forever. But I was going to make them choke on the very silence they demanded from me. They just didn't know it yet. By the next morning, the wound had formed a dark, ugly crust, but my entire cheek throbbed every time I moved my jaw. I had no antiseptic, no proper bandages. All I had was a strip of toilet paper I had taped to my face, a pathetic attempt to keep it clean. My mom was in the kitchen, stirring her coffee with a slow, lazy rhythm that told me she was no hurry to do anything that might help me. My dad sat across from her, his thumb swiping endlessly across his phone screen. Neither of them looked up when I entered the room. "You look even worse today," my mom finally commented, her eyes still fixed on her mug. "I guess ugly really does sink deeper over time." My dad let out a short, humorless laugh. "You should be thanking me," he said. "A face like that will keep you from bothering any decent men. I'm practically saving the world from having more of you around." Bile rose in my throat, hot and bitter, but I swallowed it down and kept my mouth shut. My sister strolled in then, wearing my favorite old hoodie, the one my grandmother had given me right before she died. She didn't even glance at me before she tossed her hair over her shoulder. "You're still bleeding through that paper," she said with disgust. Pathetic. It was like every second of every day was a performance for them, an endless play where my only role was to be the punchline to their cruel jokes. They got a thrill at watching me flinch, at seeing me shrink into myself. But as I sat there, forcing myself to chew on the piece of dry toast they had tossed onto the table for me without a plate, something began to shift inside my head. I started mapping out a new path. For years, they had kept me trapped using the same two weapons, fear and isolation. They had hammered into me the idea that nobody cared, that nobody would ever believe my word against theirs. And for the longest time, I had believed them. But a scar is different. A scar is a story etched onto your skin, a story that people notice even when you try to hide it. Later that week, I went to my part-time job at the small grocery store down the road. My manager, Mr. Harris, a kind, quiet man, froze when he saw my face. "My God, what happened to you?" he asked, his eyebrows pulling together in a tight line of concern. I forced a laugh that sounded thin and fake even to my own ears. "Oh, it's nothing. I just tripped over my own shoes. You know how clumsy I am." He didn't look like he believed me. Not for a second. Over the next few days, I would catch him watching me from a distance while I stocked shelves or bagged groceries. He never pushed me for more details, but I could tell he was filing things away, taking mental notes. And for the first time in my life, I didn't rush to slam that door of concern shut. Back home, the cruelty continued, but it was getting sloppy. My mom started calling me glass face in the mornings. My dad would make loud, exaggerated snoring noises whenever I sat on the couch, a constant, mocking reminder of the night he'd smashed the glass against my face. My sister, though,
She went even further. She started filming me with her phone whenever I walked into a room. She would zoom in on my scar, her face twisted in a nasty grin, and send the videos to her friends with captions like, "When you try to look important, but God disagrees." But here was the thing they didn't realize. They were getting too confident, too arrogant in their power over me. My dad started bragging to his drinking buddies about how he kept his house in order. My mom would laugh with her friends on the phone about how a little pain teaches the weak their place. And my sister, she carelessly left her phone unlocked one night. I saw it on the coffee table. The camera roll was full of her little videos and photos, a collection of evidence that told a very different story than the one about my supposed clumsiness. The real shift came the night my dad's friend, Carl, came over to watch a game. He'd had too much to drink and made a sloppy comment about my scar. "Well," he slurred, gesturing at my face, "I guess not all accidents are bad ones, eh?" My dad leaned back in his armchair like a king on his throne and chuckled. "Oh, she's lucky I didn't break her whole face," he boasted. "That's how you keep them quiet." Carl's smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second, but I saw it, and in that tiny moment, I realized the truth. They needed a specific kind of audience, one that approved of their darkness. They thrived in the shadows of our home, but they would wilt in the harsh light of real scrutiny. So I began to plant seeds, carefully, quietly. At work, I made sure Mr. Harris saw the new bruises on my arms that never seemed to fade completely. When I passed Mrs. Gable, the nosy neighbor who was always peeking over the fence, I didn't rush to cover the scar with my hair. I let my dad's angry voice carry through the open windows when he barked his insults, and I made sure my mom's high-pitched, cruel laughter followed right after it. And at night, when they thought I was sleeping on the couch, I listened. I learned their routines, their habits, their little secrets. They had made enemies they didn't even know about, old debts they hadn't paid, favors they hadn't returned, grudges that were still simmering just below the surface in our small town. I started to think that maybe I didn't have to fight them head on. Maybe all I had to do was open the right doors and let all of their own rot spill out for the world to see. By the end of the second week, my dad had no idea that the very words he'd thrown at me in the dark were being repeated in kitchens, whispered over fences, and quietly passed from one person to another like a contagion. My mom didn't notice that people had stopped waving back at her in the grocery store. My sister didn't see that her friends were starting to laugh behind her when she bragged about putting me in my place. I just kept my head down. I kept breathing too loud on purpose, and I kept waiting, because the silence I was about to give them would be louder and more devastating than anything they had ever imagined. It all came to a head on a Sunday morning, the one day of the week my parents treated like their personal stage for showing off how perfect their lives were. The living room was spotless. The coffee table was neatly stacked with my mom's fancy magazines, and the smell of freshly brewed, bitter coffee filled the air. They had invited a few important people over. My dad's friend from work who could get him cheap car parts, my mom's nosy acquaintance from church who loved to gossip, and my sister's latest boyfriend who was just as shallow and self-absorbed as she was. I, of course, was not invited to sit with them. I never was. My job was to stay in the kitchen and clean. "Don't forget to scrub the grout between the tiles," my mom had ordered, her voice cutting through the air like a sharp knife. "People notice when filth doesn't know its proper place." But this time, the guests were about to notice something else entirely. My dad was in the middle of telling some loud, self-important story when Mrs. Gable, the neighbor who had been listening through those open windows for weeks, walked right into our house. She didn't even knock. She held a phone in her hand, and the determined way she looked at my dad made his voice falter and die in his throat. "I thought you all might want to hear what the rest of the neighborhood has been hearing lately," she said, her voice clear and strong. Her finger tapped the screen of her phone. Before anyone could say a word, the room filled with sound. It was my dad's voice, booming and unmistakable from the recording. "She's lucky I didn't break her whole face. That's how you keep them quiet." Then came my mom's laugh, sharp and shrill. "A little pain teaches the weak their place." The guests froze. My sister's boyfriend leaned forward, his face turning pale. And then I saw Mr. Harris, my boss, standing right behind Mrs. Gable. I had accidentally mentioned to him that my parents were having a little get-together. Mrs. Gable connected her phone to our smart TV, and suddenly the large screen was filled with images, photos of my scar from the day it happened, swollen and bloody. The videos my sister had filmed of me, mocking me while the cut on my cheek was still fresh and weeping. The cruel, smug captions she had written filled the screen for everyone to read. "When you try to look important, but God disagrees." Nobody spoke. Not my parents, not my sister, not their guests. My dad's jaw was clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. His booming voice was gone. My mom's hand trembled as she reached for her coffee cup, her fingers fumbling and missing the handle. My sister lunged for the TV remote, but Mr. Harris calmly stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "This is what you've been doing?" he asked, his voice low but as sharp as a razor. "This is who you people really are?" I didn't have to say a single word. I just stood in the doorway of the kitchen and watched. The guests began to stand up, one by one. Some were shaking their heads in disgust. Others were avoiding eye contact with my parents, looking anywhere but at them. Mr. Harris was the first to walk out. Mrs. Gable followed, leaving the damning evidence of their cruelty playing on a loop on the television screen. The rest of the guests filed out after them, until it was just the four of us left in that perfectly clean living room. The silence was thick and suffocating. It was heavier than any sound I had ever heard. My dad opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. My mom's eyes darted around the room as if she were a trapped animal looking for an escape hatch. My sister's phone began to buzz over and over on the table, messages from her friends, no doubt, the ones who had now seen everything. I walked over to the chair by the door and picked up my thin coat. "You always told me that no one would ever believe me," I said quietly, finally looking my father directly in the eyes. "Turns out, you were wrong." Then I turned and walked out the front door. I didn't slam it. I didn't shout. I just closed it gently behind me, leaving them alone in their perfect little room with their ugly truths exposed, and no audience left to applaud their cruelty. I left them to drown in the one thing they demanded from me for so long.